All right, welcome to the first lecture of the class. And remember, there will be one of these for each religious group that we're studying this semester. That means while we're starting with Hinduism this week, next week we'll be looking at Buddhism and then move to Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Please do remember that these videos are not optional. You'll be quizzed on their content as well as the reading from the textbook at the beginning of class each week. Now, I recognize if you're watching this, it's a little like preaching to the choir to say that you need to watch the rest of them. But I want to be as clear as possible. If the flipped classroom is going to work, then we all need to come to class prepared to participate and be at the same level of understanding. That's why the work is front-loaded. In other words, that's why you have to do so much before class rather than doing most of your work after the class meeting. Now, before I get to the heart of the lecture this week, I do also want to remind everyone that they need to be thinking about the religious group they will be doing their presentations and reports on. You'll need to know what group you're going to do before coming to class next week. I'll be collecting people's topics at that point. So please do look at the syllabus and presentation handout again sometime this week so that you see what I expect. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me at colin.chapell@memphis.edu. Okay. So now that the housekeeping items are out of the way, I want to get into the heart of today's lecture on Hinduism in the United States. You should have read your textbook chapter by now that talks about the history and basic belief system of Hinduism. If you haven't, it might be a good idea to pause this lecture and do the reading first, as I'm going to assume a certain level of familiarity with what we're talking about. If you have already read, though, that's great. Now, you all know that I try to structure my lectures around a central question. This week's is going to be, how and when did Hinduism arrive in America? I'm going to try to approach this topic historically. As you know, I'm an historian. So I really do have kind of three main points. How and when did Hinduism come to the United States, like the main question? How has it grown once it got here? And what are some issues that American Hindus have faced? So that's the game plan, and let's get started. So how and when did Hinduism come to the United States? First, we need to talk about prior or before 1893. There's a strong case to be made that Hinduism came to the United States in 1893. That was when the World Parliament of Religions happened in the Chicago World's Fair. The World Parliament of Religions was a huge gathering, and certainly 1893 was a vitally important date in the history of Hinduism in the U.S. So much so that we'll talk about it later. However, I actually want to reach back even earlier in U.S. history. Historians actually point to around 1800, 1801, as some of the first times that Hinduism was talked about or written about in the United States. That's really early on that people were starting to be aware of other religious faiths. Now, I do want to be clear here. This was when white folks of Euro-American descent were talking about Hinduism, not actually people of Hindu faiths in the United States. At the time, people in the U.S. referred to adherents as Hindus and really did not make a stringent effort to understand the religious system. In the 1810s and 1820s, though, there began to be some serious interest in Hinduism from Unitarians in the U.S. and the U.K., and in the 1830s, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and a few other transcendentalists began to really study and read sacred Hindu texts. Indeed, it was their influence that really made some Americans start to take Hinduism seriously. That is not to say it was a huge religious movement in the United States or that Hinduism flourished at the time. But by the 1870s, there were a significant number of thinkers, scholars, educated readers, and other people who had heard of and been exposed to aspects of Hindu belief and philosophy. Now, why talk about this? I'm not spending too much time, really just a couple of minutes, talking about this pre-1893 period, and it's pretty vague. So why do it at all? Well, I want to make clear that Hinduism is not something that, quote-unquote, invaded the United States long after the country was founded. 1800, kind of the first writings, was really early in our country's history. And even the 1840s through 1870s were not far removed from the Founding Fathers, the American Civil War, and other early pivotal events. Hindu thought has been in the U.S. for a long, long time, folks. There was a lot of religious diversity in the United States very early in our country's history. So now let's move to 1893. Now, though there was some Hindu thought and influence in the country prior to 1893 and the World Parliament of Religions, one of the most important years for the diversification of religion in the country was 1893. As I mentioned, this was when Chicago hosted the World's Fair, and as part of that event, the organizers put together a giant gala in which faiths from all over the world were invited to send representatives and talk about spiritual beliefs. This was a watershed moment in the history of religion in the United States. 1893 and the Parliament of Religions is really something you should remember. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. It was at the 1893 World's Fair and its Parliament of Religions that many white Americans had their first interactions with people who did not believe some type of Judeo-Christian religious tradition. The Parliament may not have been, as one reporter put it, the most important event of the century, but it probably seemed so to many at the time. For 17 consecutive days, thousands of people crammed into the Hall of Columbus, wanting to see and hear from holy men from all over the world who described the faiths of their homelands. One of the holy men to speak at the Parliament of Religions was Swami Vivekananda, who argued for the validity of Hinduism, Krishna, and Vedantic philosophies and traditions. All of these, as you should know from the textbook reading you've done, derive from the Vedas, and Swami Vivekananda argued that these scriptures held, quote, the accumulated treasury of spiritual law discovered by different persons in different times. Following the Parliament, Vedanta societies sprang up as Swami Vivekananda went on a speaking tour throughout the United States. So how did Hinduism grow in the U.S. following 1893? We've covered a little bit of how and when Hinduism and Vedantic religious traditions came to the United States, both through the work of white Americans looking for transcendental beliefs and through the work of a Swami who arrived in 1893. But how did Hinduism grow once it did come here in 1893? As I hinted at in the previous section, there were a couple of Vedantic societies that started as Swami Vivekananda toured the United States. There were also other Vedantic holy men that came to the United States in the period, but there were some Bhakti-oriented Hindu holy men that also set up societies in the United States in the first part of the 20th century. One of these men was Baba Bharanti. He was a devotee of Krishna and founded the Krishna Samaj in New York City in 1902. This was one of the first non-Vedantic leaders to come to the United States. He also followed a form of Bhakti Yoga similar to what was popularized by the International Society of Krishna Consciousness later in the century. In particular, what outsiders noticed was that he advocated the repetition of the Hare Krishna mantra in order to gain enlightenment. After only a few years in the U.S., Baba Bharanti returned to India, where he died in 1914. Now, from 1914 through the 1950s, there was growth among Hindu adherents in the United States. Sometimes this was substantial and important, such as the publication of an English translation of the Bhagavad Gita in 1943. Other times, the growth seemed small and almost inconsequential. Nonetheless, there was growth through this time. Modest though it was, this growth did have cultural resonance. For example, it was in the 1950s that yoga started to be popularized as a healthy way for individuals to tone their bodies, though many of its popularizers did not go into specifics about the religious foundations of the breathing and postures. As some might expect, from the stereotypes of where religious diversity starts in the U.S., many of the areas that saw the most growth among the practitioners of Hinduism were on the coasts. Both the East and West Coast had temples, philosophical centers, churches, meditation groups, and shrines pop up. However, the coasts were not the only places where growth occurred. Chicago, St. Louis, Ann Arbor, and a few other Midwest and heartland cities acquired devotional centers before 1965. And how did Hinduism grow in the U.S. after 1965? And you might be wondering why I keep mentioning 1965 and what's so significant about that date on the timeline of Hinduism in the United States. Again, nudge, nudge. It's a significant date. At least I hope you're wondering why it's a significant date. Well, in 1965, the U.S. changed its immigration policy. At this point, the law no longer discriminated against people from Asia or the Indian subcontinent. Instead, the Immigration Act of 1965 gave preference to visa applicants whose skills were needed in the U.S. and those with professional qualifications. Immigration from India rose dramatically, and a highly educated and influential Hindu immigrant population began to grow in the U.S. After the opening of immigration laws, Hinduism really began to grow significantly. Throughout the 60s, 70s, and beyond, Hinduism attracted a growing number of adherents. The early post-1965 immigrants met in rented halls or churches for festivals. Some groups met on a more regular basis in one another's homes to study the Bhagavad Gita or conduct a puja. Eventually, these immigrants began to think on a grander scale about raising the money to build full-scale Hindu temples. In order to succeed, the scattered Hindu communities and regional societies began to work together. Now, India has a multitude of temples, but traditionally, family rituals were performed at home. In many areas of India, this began to change as temples became a venue of private rituals. In the United States, this trend continues. Temples have assumed an extremely important role in the life of a scattered Hindu community for preserving both religious and cultural identities. Hindu families will come to the temple for life cycle rituals, such as the sacred thread ceremony or weddings. The community gathers at temple for new rituals, such as a Mother's Day puja. Once the sanctuaries of the gods have been built, the community has a second phase of construction in mind, the social hall, with a large kitchen and auditorium frequently. In some cases, financial considerations and the need for a community center have actually reversed the priorities. In Louisville and Orlando, for instance, the community hall was built first, with a full-scale temple construction planned as the next phase. America's great new Hindu temples signaled the rise of a presence of a religious community that's taken to American ways. Temple membership drives and fundraisers, temple publication and newsletters, videos of temple festivals, and audio clips of devotional music are all now part of the American temple milieu. The Hindu tradition has taken firm root in cities and suburbs as well. Nonetheless, there are certainly issues that American Hindus have faced throughout their history and today. So what are some of the issues American Hindus have faced? Of course, since the beginning of the writings of white Americans about Hinduism, there have been a number of issues facing adherents. What I'm going to talk about is certainly not the entirety of these issues, just mentioning a few things. One of the first issues that many Hindus throughout the U.S. have faced has been prejudice. This issue itself has two components, some of which are intimately intertwined. One of the initial problems of prejudice has been a racial issue, because many, but certainly no means all, adherents of Hinduism are not of European ancestry. There are definitely racial prejudices against them. In history, we all know about the issues of white supremacy that have plagued the United States since early on, and these issues certainly worked against people from Asia and the Indian subcontinent. So here you can see one of the cartoons from the early 1900s about that. The other part of this issue has been religious prejudice. Because the dominant religious tradition in the United States has been Protestant Christianity, other groups have often experienced discrimination from people who have no desire to learn, respect, or interact with people of others' faiths, but who somehow feel the proper way to convert those who believe differently is to demean their faith. This is not to say that people should not disagree or even debate about faith, to the point that they firmly believe the other person is completely wrong. However, there should be no room for disrespect, demeaning comments or actions, or discrimination. And by the way, I'm going to hold that standard in the classroom. Again, I feel it is entirely appropriate for us to disagree and be honest about what we hold most dear, as long as it's done in a respectful way to those who believe differently. Of course, stereotypes are closely related to prejudice and discrimination, but I do think it deserves its own place when studying Hinduism. One of the stereotypes that arose during the 1960s and 70s was of a particular branch of Hinduism, Hare Krishna, or the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. This group was widely lampooned by media outlets and created a stereotype that often connected its demeaning portrayal of Hinduism with the hippie movement. Certainly there are other stereotypes that Hindus have had to fight in the United States. There have been stereotypes about Hindu swamis and gurus as swindling, sex-crazed charlatans, portrayals of Hindus as fanatics, and stereotypes of Hindu religious practices that are no longer in practice or that were never true to begin with. All of these have been perpetuated by popular media and often seized upon by those who really do not take the time to get to know what Hindus actually believe or what their practices really entail. That's why I'm so happy that you're in this course and that this week, or this coming week, we'll have a priest from Memphis' India Cultural Center and Temple coming to talk with us. The India Cultural Center and Temple is off of Highway 64 in Eads if you want to visit or learn more. Please do be on time for class, as we'll get started immediately with a quiz so we can talk about and have some discussion before our guest arrives. Finally, I just want to talk for a moment about other issues Hindu Americans face, and many of these are connected to immigration. While prejudice has been a significant issue that many Hindus have had to face and deal with, another issue has been one surrounding immigration. Like many immigrant communities, there's often tension between first and second generation Hindu immigrants. How much should they adopt white American culture? How much should they hang on to traditions and practices from their homeland? How do they retain cultural practices when traditional food, clothing, and implements of worship are hard to acquire? How do people retain festivals and religious practices when the next generation no longer recognizes the sacred calendar or does not even know about it? These are just some of the questions on hand for any immigrant community, but have particular resonance among many Indian and Hindu communities. That being said, in 2012, Tulsi Gabbard was the first Hindu elected to the U.S. House of Representatives for Hawaii. To get a sense of how Hinduism is growing and has become part of the U.S. in the very truest sense, Representative Gabbard is also the first American Samoan elected to the House of Representatives and is one of the first female combat veterans to be elected. In other words, we should not be looking at those who practice Hindu traditions as outside the norm of American life, but rather as part of the tapestry of religions represented in the United States. Thanks for listening. Please do remember to be on time for class. We're starting at 5:30 this coming week, so please do be on time. We'll start immediately at 5:30 with a quiz so we can go right into discussion and take a break before our guest arrives. Thank you.